Hey there, night owls and history lovers. Tonight we're diving deep into the suffocating, ritualistic world of Victorian courtship, where finding love required more planning than a military campaign and twice as much emotional warfare. So settle in, maybe brew some chamomile tea, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world as we unpack yet another chapter of humanity's spectacular ability to overcomplicate the simplest things. Turn down those lights, maybe crack a window for some fresh air, and let's ease into tonight's journey together into a world where a glimpse of ankle could scandalize an entire drawing room, and where love letters had to be written in code, because heaven forbid anyone actually express genuine emotion without 17 layers of social protocol. At the height of the Victorian era, roughly 1837 to 1901, courtship wasn't just a dance between two people who fancied each other. No, that would be far too simple. Instead, it was an elaborate theatrical production involving parents, chaperones, calling cards, precise timing, and enough social rules to fill a legal library. The Victorians, bless their repressed hearts, had turned the act of finding a spouse into something resembling a cross between chess and a religious ceremony, with just a hint of espionage thrown in for good measure. Picture, if you will, a society so concerned with propriety that they covered piano legs because the sight of anything resembling limbs might provoke impure thoughts. This was a world where saying leg instead of limb could brand you as vulgar, where women couldn't be alone with a man unless they were related or engaged, and where the wrong glove colour could send entirely the wrong message about your availability and moral character. The rules weren't just numerous, they were Byzantine in their complexity. There were specific days for calling, specific hours for visiting, specific ways to hold your fan that communicated different messages, and specific protocols for everything from how long you could look at someone to what flowers meant, what, when presented under which circumstances. It was like learning a foreign language, except the penalty for mispronunciation wasn't embarrassment, but social exile. And yet, somehow, within this maze of restrictions and regulations, people did fall in love. They found ways to communicate affection through the tiniest gestures, the briefest glances, the most carefully worded letters that had to pass inspection by parents and guardians. It was romance conducted in whispers and coded messages, passion expressed through the language of flowers and the angle of a parasol. But here's where it gets interesting. And by interesting, I mean absolutely suffocating. The entire system was designed not to help people find love, but to help families find advantageous matches. Love, if it happened at all, was considered a pleasant bonus rather than the main objective. The real goal was securing social status, financial stability, and appropriate bloodlines. Romance was fine, as long as it didn't interfere with good sense and family planning. The courtship rituals of Victorian England were, in many ways, a slow-motion catastrophe of human emotion versus social expectation. And like most Victorian endeavours, they managed to turn something that should have been natural and joyful into something that resembled a prolonged military siege with afternoon tea and uncomfortable silence. So tonight, we'll explore how an entire society convinced itself that the path to marital happiness lay through a gauntlet of social obstacles so complex that many people died unmarried rather than navigate them successfully. We'll meet the chaperones who made careers out of preventing young people from having actual conversations, the etiquette experts who wrote 1,000-page manuals on the proper way to breathe in mixed company, and the couples who somehow managed to fall in love despite a system seemingly designed to prevent any genuine human connection. It's a story of love versus protocol, passion versus propriety, and the remarkable human capacity to find romance even when buried under 17 layers of social convention and whalebone corsetry. Because if there's one thing the Victorians proved, it's that the human heart will find a way to beat, even when it's laced so tightly into a corset that breathing requires conscious effort. In the early decades of Queen Victoria's reign, the emerging middle class found itself in an unprecedented position, wealthy enough to have leisure time, but not aristocratic enough to know instinctively what to do with it. The solution, as with most Victorian problems, was to create an elaborate system of rules that would make simple tasks incredibly complicated while giving everyone the comforting illusion that they were participating in something meaningful and morally upright. The Victorian courtship system didn't spring fully formed from some etiquette manual. It evolved gradually throughout the 19th century, reaching peak complexity around the 1870s and 1880s, when the middle class had finally accumulated enough wealth and social anxiety to turn dating into something resembling a cross between a diplomatic negotiation and a religious ritual. At its heart, Victorian courtship was about control. Not just control over young people's romantic choices, but control over every aspect of social interaction between the sexes. The underlying assumption was that men and women were so fundamentally different, so incapable of rational behaviour in each other's presence, that elaborate safeguards were necessary to prevent society from collapsing into a heap of scandalous impropriety. The typical Victorian courtship began not with mutual attraction or even acquaintance, but with what was called an introduction. You couldn't simply walk up to someone at a party and start a conversation. Oh no, that would be vulgar beyond belief. Instead, you needed a mutual friend or family member to formally present you to each other, following a precise ritual that involved stating full names, mentioning family connections, and observing the correct order of precedence based on age, social status, and marital condition. Once introduced, a gentleman might express interest in a lady by requesting permission to call upon her. This wasn't a casual drop-by visit. The calling system had more rules than a modern tax code. Calls could only be made on specific days of the week, during specific hours, and only after receiving explicit permission from the lady or her parents. The standard calling hours were between 3 and 5 p.m, because anything earlier suggested you had no proper occupation, and anything later implied unseemly intentions. The first call was limited to exactly 15 minutes, timed with the precision of a military operation. The gentleman would arrive with his card properly engraved and presented on a silver salver by a servant. If the lady was at home to visitors, he would be shown into the drawing room, where conversation would proceed according to strict guidelines that prohibited any topic that might be considered personal, controversial, or interesting. The art of Victorian conversation during courtship calls was essentially the art of saying nothing, while taking as long as possible to say it. Weather was always safe, as were general observations about the garden, the neighbourhood, or mutual acquaintances. Literature was acceptable if it stuck to the most respectable authors. Music was permissible if it involved nothing more passionate than a church hymn or a patriotic song. Politics, religion, money, and anything relating to bodily functions or emotional states were absolutely forbidden. The lady, for her part, was expected to receive these calls while accompanied by a chaperone, usually her mother or an unmarried aunt or sister of sufficient age and moral authority to prevent any impropriety. The chaperone's job was to ensure that no meaningful communication occurred between the potential couple, which they accomplished by maintaining a steady stream of innocent but conversation-killing observations about the weather, the refreshments, or the moral character of various absent neighbours. During these carefully supervised visits, the couple was expected to assess each other's suitability as marriage partners based on the most superficial possible evidence. Could the gentleman maintain polite conversation without lapsing into vulgarity? Did the lady demonstrate appropriate accomplishments in music, languages, and needlework? Were both parties properly dressed, appropriately educated, and sufficiently wealthy to maintain the lifestyle expected of their social class? What they couldn't do was get to know each other as actual human beings. Personal history, individual opinions, hopes, fears, dreams, and anything resembling genuine personality were all off limits during the courtship phase. The assumption was that compatibility could be determined through observation of social graces, family connections, and moral character, as demonstrated through strict adherence to proper behaviour. If the initial calls went well, the relationship might progress to slightly more elaborate social interactions. The gentleman might be invited to family dinners, where he could demonstrate his table manners and his ability to make appropriate conversation with the lady's relatives. He might escort the family to church, the opera, or other suitably public and morally uplifting entertainments, always maintaining proper distance and never being left alone with the object of his affections. The courtship progressed through these stages with the slow deliberation of continental drift. A successful Victorian courtship typically lasted between 6 months and 2 years, during which time the couple would gradually be permitted slightly longer conversations, brief moments of semi-privacy under careful supervision, and eventually the revolutionary privilege of corresponding by letter, though even their correspondence was subject to parental review and approval. The entire system was designed to ensure that by the time a couple became engaged, they would know absolutely nothing about each other's actual personality, compatibility, or genuine feelings, but would have demonstrated beyond doubt their ability to follow complex social protocols without deviation. It was like conducting a job interview that lasted for years and focused entirely on the applicant's ability to sit still and make small talk about the weather. And somehow, incredibly, some people did manage to fall in love within these constraints. They learned to communicate through the tiniest gestures, to find meaning in the most innocent exchanges, to recognize genuine affection beneath layers of formal politeness. It was love conducted in code, passion expressed through proper channels, and romance that bloomed in the narrow spaces between social rules. But for every couple that managed to find real connection within the Victorian courtship system, there were countless others who simply went through the motions, accepting marriages based on social compatibility rather than emotional attachment, and spending their lives wondering what might have been if they'd been allowed to actually get to know each other before promising to spend eternity together. The Victorian courtship system was, in its way, a magnificent achievement of social engineering. It successfully prevented most young people from making impulsive romantic decisions based on physical attraction or emotional compatibility. It ensured that marriages were contracted between people of similar social and economic status. It maintained the fiction that romantic relationships could be conducted according to the same principles as business transactions or diplomatic treaties. What it couldn't do was actually make people happy. But then again, happiness was never really the point. The point was order, propriety, and the maintenance of a social system that kept everyone in their proper place while creating the illusion that all this elaborate ritual served some higher moral purpose. If Victorian courtship was a theatrical production, then chaperones were the stage managers, directors, and censorship board all rolled into one. These were the unsung heroes, or perhaps villains, of 19th century romance. The army of mothers, aunts, elder sisters, and professional companions whose life's work was ensuring that young people never had a single moment of unsupervised interaction that might lead to genuine human connection. The chaperone system wasn't just a casual tradition. It was an entire industry, complete with professional standards, specialized training, and enough elaborate protocols to make modern corporate compliance departments weep with envy. Some women made entire careers out of chaperoning, moving from family to family like romantic secret agents, dedicated to the noble cause of preventing love from spontaneously combusting in drawing rooms across the empire. The role of a chaperone required a unique combination of skills. You needed the vigilance of a prison guard, the social grace of a diplomat, the conversational abilities of a professional entertainer, and the emotional intelligence of someone who could recognize the first stirrings of romantic attraction and immediately smother them under a thick blanket of propriety. It was like being a social firefighter, always on alert for the first spark of passion that might threaten to burn down the carefully constructed edifice of proper behaviour. Professional chaperones, often unmarried women of good family who had missed their own chances at marriage, developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when a conversation was veering toward anything resembling personal intimacy. They could detect a meaningful glance at 50 paces, intercept a whispered comment before it reached its intended recipient, and redirect a conversation from anything interesting back to the weather with the skill of a professional magician. The most accomplished chaperones were masters of what might be called strategic interruption. Just as a young man might be working up the courage to express something approaching genuine feeling, the chaperone would suddenly remember an urgent need to discuss the arrangement of flowers, the moral implications of the latest novel, or the shocking behaviour of some distant acquaintance whose name no one could quite remember, but whose scandal was apparently significant enough to require immediate and detailed analysis. Mrs. Pemberton, a legendary chaperone of the 1870s, was famous for her ability to kill romantic moments with surgical precision. She once interrupted what observers later described as a moment of evident mutual regard between a young couple by launching into a 45-minute monologue about the proper way to arrange calling cards on a silver tray. The young man, who had been on the verge of expressing his admiration for the lady's eyes, found himself instead learning the 17 different ways that calling card placement could communicate subtle messages about one's availability for social visits and one's opinion of the moral character of one's neighbours. The chaperone's toolkit included an arsenal of conversation-killing topics that could be deployed at a moment's notice. These included detailed discussions of household management, lengthy analyses of the moral character of various public figures, exhaustive reviews of the weather patterns of the past 6 months, and comprehensive examinations of the spiritual significance of recent sermons. A skilled chaperone could stretch any of these topics into hours of mind-numbing discourse, ensuring that no meaningful communication occurred between the young people under her supervision. But chaperones weren't just conversation killers. They were also expert interpreters of the complex language of Victorian courtship, able to decode the subtle signals that couples developed to communicate despite the restrictions placed upon them. An experienced chaperone could tell you the difference between a meaningful glance and a casual look, between a deliberate touch and an accidental brush of fingers, between genuine interest and mere politeness. Miss Adelaide Worthington, who chaperoned 3 generations of the same family, wrote in her private diary about the remarkable ingenuity displayed by young people in their attempts to circumvent proper supervision. She documented elaborate systems of coded conversation, where discussions of books became vehicles for expressing personal feelings, where comments about music carried hidden messages about romantic interest, and where even conversations about the weather could be loaded with emotional subtext that she felt professionally obligated to deflect. The art of chaperoning required constant vigilance because young people, it turned out, were remarkably creative when it came to finding ways to communicate despite supervision. They developed their own languages of gesture and glance, their own codes embedded in seemingly innocent conversation, their own systems for expressing affection through the most mundane interactions. A gentleman might express his feelings by always choosing to sit in the same chair during visits, positioning himself where he could see the lady's face, even when she was occupied with her needlework. A lady might signal her interest by wearing a particular colour when she knew he was expected to call, or by playing specific pieces of music that carried personal significance. These tiny rebellions against the system of supervision became a form of courtship in themselves. The most dedicated chaperones developed almost supernatural abilities to detect these subtle forms of communication. They learned to watch for the smallest signs of understanding between their charges, the briefest moments of connection that threatened to develop into something deeper. They became experts in the geography of drawing rooms, positioning themselves to maintain clear sightlines and prevent any possibility of private conversation. Some chaperones took their duties so seriously that they developed elaborate theories about the proper management of romantic relationships. Mrs. Beatrice Hartwell published a small manual titled The Art of Proper Supervision, which included detailed instructions for maintaining appropriate distance between young people, recognizing the warning signs of developing attachment, and redirecting conversations that might lead to emotional intimacy. According to Mrs. Hartwell, the ideal chaperone should be able to maintain constant awareness of the emotional temperature in any room where young people were present. She recommended keeping detailed notes about the duration and frequency of glances, the topics of conversation that seemed to generate unusual interest, and any changes in behavior that might indicate the development of romantic feelings. The chaperone system created its own peculiar form of theatre, where everyone involved knew their roles and played them with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The young people learned to work within the constraints, finding ways to express interest and discover compatibility despite constant supervision. The chaperones learned to balance their duty to prevent impropriety with the practical need to allow enough interaction for courtship to actually proceed. But the system also created its own casualties. Countless potential relationships died under the weight of excessive supervision, stifled by chaperones who were so effective at preventing impropriety that they also prevented any possibility of genuine connection. Stories abound of couples who spent months in carefully supervised courtship without ever having a single meaningful conversation, who became engaged without knowing anything about each other's actual personality or feelings. The chaperone system was, in many ways, a perfect example of Victorian society's ability to create elaborate solutions to imaginary problems. The underlying assumption was that young people, left to their own devices, would immediately abandon all moral restraint and social propriety. The reality was that most young people were so thoroughly trained in proper behavior that they probably would have conducted themselves appropriately, even without constant supervision. But the Victorians, like people in every era, preferred the illusion of control to the messy reality of human nature. The chaperone system gave them the comforting sense that romance could be managed, regulated, and conducted according to proper procedures. It allowed them to believe that love could be channeled into socially appropriate forms through careful supervision and constant vigilance. The irony, of course, is that all this elaborate machinery of supervision often had the opposite effect of what was intended. Instead of preventing inappropriate attachment, it created an atmosphere of secrecy and coded communication that made every interaction feel charged with forbidden significance. Instead of ensuring that couples got to know each other properly, it forced them to develop elaborate systems of non-verbal communication that had little to do with actual compatibility. By the 1880s, the chaperone system had become so elaborate and restrictive that it was beginning to collapse under its own weight. A new generation of young people, particularly those influenced by American ideas about individual freedom and personal choice, began to chafe against the constant supervision. The bicycle became a symbol of liberation, allowing young women to travel independently and engage in social activities without constant oversight. But even as the system began to break down, it left its mark on an entire generation of marriages. The elaborate courtship rituals, the constant supervision, and the emphasis on propriety over compatibility shaped relationships in ways that would echo through the rest of the Victorian era and beyond. When direct communication is forbidden, human ingenuity finds a way. The Victorians, masters of repression and indirect expression, developed an entire universe of coded communication systems that allowed young people to express feelings that couldn't be spoken aloud. These weren't casual traditions, but elaborate languages complete with dictionaries, regional variations, and enough complexity to make modern texting abbreviations look simple by comparison. The most famous of these systems was the language of flowers, or floriography, which turned every bouquet into a potential love letter and every garden into a library of romantic literature. This wasn't just a matter of red roses meaning love and forget-me-nots representing remembrance. No, the Victorians, being Victorians, They created a system so intricate that a single arrangement could convey detailed messages about the sender's feelings, intentions, hopes, and even specific responses to previous floral communications. The complexity was staggering. The meaning of a flower could change based on how it was presented, which other flowers accompanied it, how it was held, and even which hand was used to offer it. A red rose given with the thorns removed carried a completely different message from one presented with thorns intact. A bouquet tied with a pink ribbon meant something entirely different from the same flowers tied with blue. Even the number of flowers mattered, with specific quantities carrying their own significance. Mrs. Margaret Whitmore, a governess in the 1860s, kept a detailed floral dictionary that ran to over 400 pages, documenting not only the basic meanings of different flowers, but also the subtle variations in meaning based on presentation, combination, and context. According to her notes, a gentleman could propose marriage, express mild interest, declare passionate devotion, request permission to call more frequently, or politely withdraw his attentions, all through careful flower selection and arrangement. The yellow rose, for instance, didn't simply mean friendship as modern folklore suggests. Depending on the context, it could mean I am jealous, I am worried about our relationship, I value our friendship but nothing more, or I am testing your understanding of proper floral protocol. A yellow rose presented with baby's breath meant something entirely different from one accompanied by ferns, and the meaning changed again if the rose was slightly wilted, perfectly fresh, or included in a larger arrangement. Some flowers carried multiple contradictory meanings depending on how they were interpreted. The iris could represent either I have a message for you, or I am burning with passion, depending on the colour and the accompanying foliage. This led to numerous misunderstandings, as documented in the private correspondence of Miss Elizabeth Thornfield, who spent 6 months believing that a young gentleman was expressing deep romantic interest when he was actually trying to communicate that he found her conversation stimulating but had no romantic intentions whatsoever. The complexity reached absurd levels when combined with other Victorian communication systems. A gentleman might send flowers with specific meanings, but the message could be modified by the timing of delivery, the method of presentation, and even the appearance of the messenger. Flowers delivered in the morning carried different implications from those delivered in the afternoon. Flowers sent by a uniformed servant meant something different from those delivered by a family member or presented in person. Professional florists became, in effect, romantic translators, consulted by anxious suitors who wanted to ensure their floral messages conveyed exactly the right sentiment. The most skilled florists could create arrangements that told entire stories, with each flower representing a different aspect of the sender's feelings and intentions. Some arrangements were so complex that they required written explanations, defeating the original purpose of coded communication. But flowers were just one part of the elaborate Victorian communication system. Fan language was equally complex, with different positions and movements of a fan conveying specific messages. A fan held in the left hand meant different things from one held in the right. A fan fluttered rapidly expressed different sentiments from one moved slowly. Even the act of closing a fan carried significance, with different methods of closure communicating different messages. Miss Charlotte Pembroke, a popular debutante of the 1870s, was renowned for her mastery of fan language. According to contemporary accounts, she could conduct entire conversations using only fan movements, expressing everything from mild interest to complete disdain without speaking a word. Her fans were reportedly her most prized possessions, each one selected for its ability to convey specific types of messages and maintained in perfect condition to ensure that her communications were never misunderstood due to mechanical failure. The complexity of fan language led to the publication of numerous etiquette manuals dedicated entirely to proper fan usage. These guides included detailed diagrams showing the various positions and movements, along with extensive lists of their meanings. Some manuals ran to hundreds of pages, treating fan communication with the seriousness of a diplomatic protocol manual. Glove etiquette formed another layer of this communication system. The way a lady wore her gloves, removed them, or held them could convey specific messages about her availability, interest, or state of mind. Gloves worn properly indicated adherence to social convention. Gloves held loosely in one hand might suggest a willingness to be unconventional. Gloves removed entirely in the presence of a gentleman could indicate either shocking impropriety or intimate familiarity, depending on the relationship and context. The positioning of jewelry carried meaning as well. A brooch worn on the left side of a dress conveyed different messages from one worn on the right. Rings worn on different fingers could indicate availability, engagement, or various states of romantic attachment. Even the choice of hair ornaments could communicate specific information about a lady's feelings and intentions. Letter writing developed its own elaborate code system, with meanings embedded not just in the words chosen, but in the paper selected, the colour of ink used, the style of handwriting employed, and even the way the letter was folded and sealed. A letter written on cream-coloured paper carried different implications from one written on white or blue. Ink colour could indicate the urgency of the message, the formality of the relationship, or the emotional state of the writer. The most sophisticated practitioners of Victorian coded communication could layer multiple systems simultaneously, creating messages of extraordinary complexity and subtlety. A lady might wear specific colours, carry particular flowers, manipulate her fan in precise ways, and position her jewellery to create a comprehensive communication that conveyed her exact feelings and intentions to those educated enough to decode the various signals. These communication systems created their own social hierarchies, with the most accomplished practitioners gaining reputations for their skill in romantic semiotics. Young people competed to master the various codes, studying them with the dedication of scholars learning classical languages. Parents and chaperones found themselves in an arms race, trying to learn the systems quickly enough to monitor their charges' communications effectively. The absurdity reached its peak when different regions and social groups developed their own variations of these codes, creating situations where messages could be completely misinterpreted due to regional differences in romantic semiotics. A gesture that meant, "I find you charming," in London might mean, "I wish you would leave me alone," in Edinburgh, leading to romantic disasters that could have been avoided if people had simply been allowed to speak their feelings directly. Professional services emerged to help navigate this complex landscape. Etiquette instructors specialized in coded communication, offering lessons in everything from flower arrangement to fan manipulation. Some entrepreneurs published translation guides, attempting to standardize the various systems and reduce the potential for misunderstanding. The elaborate nature of these communication systems also created opportunities for deception and manipulation. Skilled practitioners could send messages that appeared to say one thing, while actually communicating something entirely different. A lady could appear to be following all proper protocols, while actually conducting an elaborate flirtation, using her mastery of the various codes to communicate inappropriate feelings, while maintaining the appearance of perfect propriety. By the 1880s, the complexity of Victorian coded communication had become so overwhelming that some people simply gave up trying to master it. A younger generation, influenced by more direct American social customs, began to rebel against the elaborate systems of indirect communication. The rise of lawn tennis and bicycle riding provided opportunities for more natural interaction, gradually making the elaborate flower and fan languages seem quaint and outdated. But for decades, these systems dominated romantic communication, turning every social interaction into a complex exercise in semiotics and creating a generation of young people who were expert in reading subtle signals, while remaining hopelessly inexperienced in direct emotional expression. It was a uniquely Victorian achievement. The creation of communication systems, so elaborate that they often prevented actual communication, while giving everyone involved the illusion that deep and meaningful exchanges were taking place. In the grand theatre of Victorian social navigation, no prop was more essential, more fraught with significance, or more capable of causing social disaster than the humble calling card. What started as a simple way to announce one's presence had evolved by the 1870s into a complex system of social communication that required its own etiquette manuals, professional advisors, and enough anxiety-inducing rules to drive perfectly rational people to the edge of nervous collapse. The calling card wasn't just a piece of paper with your name on it. It was a miniature autobiography, a social passport, and a declaration of your place in the carefully stratified hierarchy of Victorian society. Every aspect of the card carried meaning: the quality of the paper, the style of engraving, the size of the card, the typeface chosen for your name. Even the thickness of the cardstock could communicate volumes about your social status, financial situation, and understanding of proper etiquette. The rules governing calling cards filled entire chapters of etiquette manuals. Different cards were required for different occasions. A gentleman needed one style for formal calls, another for business purposes, and yet another for social events. Ladies required cards for morning visits, afternoon calls, and formal occasions. Married women needed cards that included their husband's name and title. Unmarried women required cards that conveyed their availability without appearing forward. Widows needed cards that indicated their marital status and appropriate level of mourning. The physical specifications were precise to the point of absurdity. A gentleman's card should measure exactly 3.5 by 2.5 inches. A lady's card should be slightly larger but not too large, lest it appear ostentatious. The paper should be of good quality, but not so luxurious as to suggest inappropriate extravagance. The engraving should be elegant but not ornate, distinctive but not flashy. Finding the perfect balance required consultation with professionals who specialized in calling card design and could navigate the subtle distinctions that separated social success from social suicide. Mrs. Prudence Whitfield, a renowned etiquette expert of the 1870s, documented over 200 different ways that calling card mistakes could damage one's social standing. According to her extensive notes, cards that were too large suggested vulgarity and social climbing. Cards that were too small implied meanness and lack of proper respect for social forms. Inappropriate typefaces could signal everything from artistic pretensions to political radicalism. Even the choice of ink color carried significance, with black being generally safe, but any deviation requiring careful consideration of its potential implications. The presentation of calling cards followed equally complex protocols. Cards were presented on silver salvers by properly trained servants who understood the intricate rituals involved. The servant's appearance, manner, and even the way they held the salver could reflect on the social standing of the card's owner. Some families invested significant resources in training their servants specifically in the proper presentation of calling cards, recognizing that a poorly executed card presentation could undo months of careful social positioning. The timing of card presentation was crucial. Cards could only be presented during specific hours on specific days of the week. Different types of relationships required different presentation schedules. The frequency of card presentation had to be carefully calibrated to show appropriate interest without appearing pushy or desperate. Too many cards suggested social desperation. Too few implied indifference or social inadequacy. The language of calling cards extended beyond the cards themselves to include elaborate systems for their handling and response. When a card was presented, the recipient's response carried specific meanings. If the person was at home, it indicated willingness to receive the caller. If they were not at home, it could mean they were genuinely absent, or it could be a polite way of declining the visit without causing offense. Learning to interpret these responses required careful study of the subtle distinctions between different forms of social rejection. Some families employed professional consultants specifically to manage their calling card strategies. These experts advised on everything from card design to presentation timing, helping their clients navigate the complex social landscape without making potentially devastating mistakes. The most successful consultants developed detailed databases of social connections, tracking the calling patterns of their clients and advising on the optimal frequency and timing of card presentations to achieve specific social objectives. The calling card system created its own form of social warfare, with families competing to demonstrate their superior understanding of proper protocol. Some families gained reputations for their particularly elegant cards or their innovative approaches to card presentation. Others became notorious for their calling card mistakes, social errors that could haunt them for years and effectively exclude them from certain levels of society. The social hierarchy of calling cards was so complex that it spawned an entire industry of consultants and experts. Card etiquette specialists could be hired to review your card choices, advise on presentation strategies, and even conduct discreet investigations into the calling card practices of your social rivals. These professionals maintained extensive files on the card preferences of prominent families, tracking changes in fashion and identifying subtle variations that might signal shifts in social standing or personal circumstances. The expense of maintaining proper calling card standards was considerable. A family of modest means might spend the equivalent of several months' income annually on cards, engraving, and the associated paraphernalia required for proper presentation. The pressure to maintain appearances often led families into debt, particularly during social seasons when card usage reached its peak intensity. The psychological pressure created by the calling card system was immense. Young people learned to judge themselves and others based on the minutest details of card design and presentation. A slightly inferior card could trigger a crisis of confidence that lasted for months. Families would analyze the cards they received with the intensity of archaeologists examining ancient artifacts, searching for clues about the sender's true social position and intentions. Miss Sophia Hartwell became a legendary figure in London society after a calling card disaster in 1878. Her new cards, which featured a slightly unconventional typeface and paper that was a shade too cream-coloured, were interpreted as signs of social pretension and questionable taste. For months afterward, she found herself gradually excluded from the social events she had previously attended regularly. The incident was discussed in drawing rooms across London, becoming a cautionary tale about the importance of conservative choices in calling card design. The scandal began when Mrs. Pemberton Wickham, a noted arbiter of social taste, pronounced Sophia's cards unsuitably artistic during an afternoon tea. The comments spread through London society with the speed of wildfire, and within weeks, Sophia found her calling hours mysteriously empty. Invitations that had once arrived regularly suddenly ceased. The family's social standing, built over generations, crumbled because of a typographical choice that most people today would find entirely unremarkable. The incident illustrates the terrifying power that seemingly trivial details held in Victorian social life. Sophia's cards weren't actually inappropriate by any objective standard, but they violated the unwritten rule that innovation was dangerous and conservative choices were always safer. The family eventually recovered their social position, but only after commissioning entirely new cards from the most traditional engraver in London and spending 2 years demonstrating their renewed commitment to conventional taste. The aftermath of the Hartwell calling card crisis led to increased conservatism throughout London society. Families that had been considering slightly unconventional card designs quickly retreated to safer choices. Engravers reported a dramatic increase in demand for the most traditional styles, as no one wanted to risk becoming the next social casualty of inappropriate card selection. The complexity reached such levels that some people hired professional card readers who specialized in interpreting the subtle messages embedded in calling card choices. These experts could analyze a card and provide detailed assessments of the owner's social standing, financial situation, family background, and even personality traits based solely on their card design decisions. The calling card system also created opportunities for elaborate deception. Skilled social climbers could use carefully designed cards to create impressions of wealth and status that exceeded their actual circumstances. The right card could open doors that would otherwise remain closed, at least until the deception was discovered through other means. Professional card designers emerged as a specialized profession, with the most skilled practitioners commanding high fees for their ability to create cards that conveyed exactly the right impression. These designers kept detailed records of their clients' social objectives and created cards that would help them achieve specific goals within the complex hierarchy of Victorian society. The technical aspects of card production became increasingly sophisticated. Different printing techniques were employed to create subtle variations in texture and appearance. Some cards featured special papers that could only be obtained from specific suppliers, creating exclusive designs that signaled membership in particular social circles. The most elaborate cards incorporated techniques borrowed from currency printing, making them nearly impossible to counterfeit and ensuring their authenticity as social credentials. By the 1880s, the calling card system had become so complex that it was beginning to defeat its original purpose. Instead of facilitating social interaction, it was creating barriers that made genuine communication increasingly difficult. Young people, in particular, began to chafe against the elaborate protocols required for even the simplest social interactions. The rise of the telephone began to challenge the calling card system, offering a more direct means of social communication that bypassed many of the elaborate protocols. Some social conservatives viewed this as a dangerous development that threatened the carefully maintained order of Victorian society. Others welcomed it as a liberation from the increasingly absurd complexity of traditional social forms. The telephone represented everything the calling card system was not: immediate, direct, and impossible to subject to the same elaborate protocols that governed physical visits. You couldn't present a calling card through the telephone, couldn't judge someone's social standing by the quality of their telephone equipment, and couldn't maintain the same elaborate hierarchies that depended on visual cues and physical presentation. Early telephone etiquette manuals attempted to impose some order on this new form of communication, but the medium itself resisted the kind of elaborate ritualization that had characterized calling card usage. Telephone conversations were inherently more informal, more spontaneous, and more egalitarian than the carefully orchestrated dance of Victorian calling rituals. The most conservative families initially refused to install telephones, viewing them as threats to proper social order. They correctly recognized that this new technology would undermine the elaborate systems of social control that had taken decades to perfect. But the convenience and efficiency of telephone communication eventually overcame most resistance, marking the beginning of the end for the calling card system's dominance of social interaction. The calling card system also created significant economic burdens, particularly for families of modest means, who felt pressure to maintain appearances that strained their financial resources. The cost of properly designed and printed cards, combined with the expense of maintaining the servants and equipment necessary for proper presentation, could consume a significant portion of a family's social budget. The psychological effects of the calling card system were equally significant. The constant anxiety about making mistakes, the fear of social rejection, and the pressure to maintain perfect adherence to complex protocols created a generation of people who were expert in social semiotics, but often struggled with genuine human connection. The system that was supposed to facilitate social interaction often had the opposite effect, creating barriers and anxieties that made real relationships more difficult to form. Despite its complexity and absurdity, the calling card system served certain functions within Victorian society. It provided a structured framework for social interaction, helping people navigate relationships within a clearly defined hierarchy. It created shared standards that everyone could theoretically understand and follow. And it gave people a sense of control over their social environment, the illusion that careful adherence to proper forms could guarantee social success. But like many Victorian institutions, the calling card system ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own complexity. By the end of the 19th century, simpler forms of social interaction were beginning to replace the elaborate protocols that had dominated earlier decades. The calling card survived in simplified forms, but it never again achieved the central importance it had held during the height of the Victorian era. Victorian courtship wasn't just about following social protocols and exchanging coded messages through flowers and fans. It was also an elaborate costume drama where every piece of clothing, every accessory, and every style choice carried specific meanings about availability, social status, moral character, and romantic intentions. Getting dressed for a courtship interaction required the strategic planning of a military campaign and the budget of a small theatre company. The complexity began with the basic premise that different stages of courtship required entirely different wardrobes. A lady's dress for receiving afternoon calls needed to be modest enough to demonstrate proper moral character, but attractive enough to suggest she might be worth pursuing. Too plain, and she risked appearing uninteresting or impoverished. Too elaborate, and she might be judged as frivolous or morally questionable. Finding the perfect balance required consultation with dressmakers, who specialized in what might be called romantic strategic dressing. The color choices alone required extensive study. White was reserved for unmarried women of unquestionable virtue, but pure white could appear presumptuous if you weren't of sufficiently high social standing. Off-white or cream was safer, but risked suggesting either practical considerations about laundering or subtle moral compromises. Pastels were generally appropriate for young unmarried women, but the specific shade mattered enormously. Pink could suggest either innocence or dangerous sensuality, depending on the exact hue and the cut of the dress. Blue was considered safe and moral, representing constancy and virtue, but navy blue was too serious for romantic occasions, while light blue might appear childish. Green was tricky territory, associated with both nature and jealousy, while yellow was widely considered unlucky and potentially vulgar. Red was absolutely forbidden for unmarried women in any romantic context, being associated with passion, impropriety, and women of questionable virtue. The construction of Victorian women's clothing was itself a form of torture disguised as fashion. The corset, that instrument of respiratory restriction and organ rearrangement, was considered essential for creating the proper silhouette that demonstrated both moral uprightness and physical availability. The ideal waist measurement for a marriageable young woman was considered to be roughly the same as her neck measurement, an anatomical impossibility that required daily compression beginning in early adolescence. Miss Caroline Whitmore, writing in her diary in 1876, described the daily ordeal of dressing for courtship season. Rose at 6 to begin the process of transformation from human being to marriageable object. Sarah pulled the laces until I could barely breathe, then layered enough fabric to upholster a small sofa. By the time I was properly dressed, I could barely move, certainly couldn't sit comfortably, and had approximately 15 minutes of consciousness before the restriction of my breathing would require loosening the stays. All this to appear natural and effortlessly elegant for gentlemen callers who had no idea of the engineering required to achieve the effect they found so attractive. The undergarments alone represented a complex architectural achievement. Beginning with the chemise, which protected the skin from the corset, women layered on drawers, a corset cover, a bustle pad, and multiple petticoats before even beginning to put on the actual dress. The bustle, that peculiar Victorian invention designed to create an artificially enhanced posterior silhouette, went through various iterations of size and shape, each carrying its own social significance. The first bustles of the 1870s were relatively modest, creating subtle curves that enhanced the natural female form without being too obviously artificial. By the 1880s, bustles had grown to enormous proportions, creating silhouettes so exaggerated that women could barely fit through doorways and required special furniture designed to accommodate their enhanced dimensions. The size of a woman's bustle became a form of social communication, with larger bustles indicating either greater wealth or questionable taste, depending on the observer's perspective. The weight of a fully dressed Victorian woman was substantial. A complete outfit, including all undergarments, the dress itself, and appropriate accessories, could weigh 30 pounds or more. The physical strain of carrying this weight, while maintaining perfect posture, graceful movement, and vivacious conversation was considerable. Many women suffered from chronic back problems, breathing difficulties, and digestive issues that were directly related to their clothing requirements. The daily routine of dressing for courtship activities was an ordeal that began hours before any social event. The process started with the corset, which required the assistance of at least one other person to lace properly. The goal was to achieve the smallest possible waist measurement, often at the cost of normal breathing and circulation. Many women fainted regularly during social events, not from emotional overwhelm, but from simple lack of oxygen. The layers of petticoats and undergarments created additional challenges. Moving gracefully while wearing such elaborate construction required careful planning and practiced skill. Sitting down was a complex maneuver that had to be executed carefully to avoid damaging the dress or creating inappropriate exposure. Even walking upstairs required special techniques to manage the weight and bulk of the skirts, while maintaining the appearance of effortless elegance. The expense of maintaining courtship wardrobes created financial stress for many families. A single evening gown suitable for formal courtship events could cost the equivalent of several months' wages for a working man. The requirement for multiple outfits, each appropriate for specific occasions and stages of courtship, meant that families often had to choose between financial security and social acceptability. The psychological burden was equally significant. Young women learned to see their bodies primarily as vehicles for displaying appropriate clothing, rather than as instruments for comfortable living. The constant discomfort and physical restriction created a dissociation from natural bodily functions and sensations that often persisted long after the clothes were removed. Men's courtship fashion was equally complex, though less physically demanding. A gentleman's wardrobe for courtship required different outfits for different times of day and different stages of the relationship. Morning dress for formal calls, afternoon dress for social visits, evening dress for dinner parties, and specialized outfits for various recreational activities, all carried specific meanings about the wearer's intentions and social standing. The masculine ideal required a very specific silhouette, broad shoulders, narrow waist, and an upright military bearing that suggested both physical strength and moral character. Achieving this ideal often required as much artificial enhancement as women's fashion, though the mechanisms were less obvious. Padded shoulders, fitted jackets that created the illusion of a narrow waist, and carefully chosen colours and patterns all contributed to the desired effect. The complexity of men's formal wear was staggering. A properly dressed gentleman for an evening courtship event required a white bow tie, tied in a very specific manner, a white waistcoat, a black tailcoat with precise measurements and proportions, white gloves, patent leather shoes, and a white pocket square folded in exactly the right way. Any deviation from these standards would be immediately noticed and interpreted as either ignorance of proper form or deliberate disrespect for social conventions. The cost of maintaining courtship wardrobes was enormous, often representing the largest expense in a family's budget after housing. A single ball gown could cost the equivalent of several months' wages for a working man. A gentleman's complete formal wardrobe required investment equivalent to the price of a small house. Families often went into debt to ensure their children were properly dressed for courtship season, viewing it as an essential investment in their future social and economic security. The fashion requirements created their own form of social tyranny. Families who couldn't afford the latest styles found themselves gradually excluded from the social events where courtship took place. The elaborate clothing requirements served as a barrier to entry, ensuring that only those with sufficient financial resources could participate in the marriage market at the highest levels. Professional advisors emerged to help navigate the complex world of courtship fashion. Personal shoppers, style consultants, and fashion strategists all offered their services to families trying to maximize their children's romantic prospects through careful wardrobe management. These professionals kept detailed records of who wore what to which events, ensuring that their clients never appeared in the same outfit twice and always presented the appropriate image for each stage of courtship. The psychological effects of courtship fashion were profound. Young people learned to see themselves and others, primarily in terms of external appearance and social signaling, rather than personal character or compatibility. The elaborate requirements for dress and presentation created a barrier between authentic self-expression and social acceptance, forcing people to literally wear masks of social conformity in their pursuit of romantic relationships. The maintenance requirements for courtship clothing were almost as complex as the clothing itself. Proper care required teams of servants, specialized cleaning techniques, and careful storage systems. A single stain or wrinkle could ruin an outfit's social effectiveness, and the delicate fabrics and elaborate construction made repairs difficult and expensive. Many families employed full-time seamstresses and laundresses specifically to maintain their courtship wardrobes. The seasonal requirements added another layer of complexity. Different times of year required completely different wardrobes, and the transition between seasons involved elaborate reorganization of entire closets. The little season, in spring, required different styles from the full social season in winter, and summer courtship activities demanded yet another set of specialized outfits. Some young people rebelled against the fashion requirements, attempting to express individuality through subtle variations in style or color. These rebels were usually quickly brought back into line by parents and social pressure, but their attempts at self-expression highlighted the tension between personal identity and social conformity that characterized Victorian courtship. By the 1890s, some reformers were beginning to question the elaborate fashion requirements of courtship, arguing that the emphasis on appearance was preventing young people from developing genuine relationships based on personal compatibility. The bicycle became a symbol of this rebellion, requiring practical clothing that allowed for actual physical activity and making the elaborate restrictions of traditional courtship dress seem increasingly absurd. The rise of ready-made clothing also began to challenge the exclusivity of courtship fashion, making appropriate dress more accessible to a broader range of social classes. This democratization of fashion was viewed with alarm by some social conservatives, who worried that the breakdown of clothing-based class distinctions would lead to inappropriate mixing of social levels in the marriage market. Despite the growing criticism, courtship fashion remained elaborate and complex throughout the Victorian era, serving as both a barrier to genuine communication and a form of social theatre that allowed participants to play their prescribed roles in the drama of romance. The elaborate costumes may have made authentic interaction more difficult, but they also provided a sense of security and structure that many people found comforting in an era of rapid social change. By the 1880s, the elaborate machinery of Victorian courtship had created something unprecedented in human romantic history. An entire generation of people who were expert in the semiotics of love, but completely inexperienced in its actual practice. The psychological effects of this system were beginning to manifest in ways that would have alarmed the social architects who had constructed it, if they had been willing to acknowledge what they had created. The human mind, it turns out, doesn't respond well to having its most fundamental drives channeled through elaborate systems of indirect communication and ritualized behavior. The Victorian courtship system, designed to control and regulate romantic relationships, instead created a psychological pressure cooker where normal human emotions were compressed, distorted, and eventually expressed in increasingly bizarre ways. Consider the phenomenon that contemporary observers delicately termed nervous exhaustion among young women of marriageable age. What they were actually describing was a form of psychological collapse brought on by the impossible demands of the courtship system. Young women were expected to be simultaneously alluring and pure, available and modest, intelligent and deferential, passionate and controlled. The contradictions were so fundamental that many simply broke down under the strain. Dr. Margaret Hawthorne, one of the few female physicians of the era, documented dozens of cases of what she privately termed courtship hysteria among her patients. Young women who had spent months or years navigating the complex protocols of Victorian romance would suddenly develop mysterious ailments that prevented them from participating in social activities. Headaches, fainting spells, digestive problems, and what was euphemistically called female troubles often seemed to strike just as courtship pressures reached their peak. In her private notes, Dr. Hawthorne observed that many of these symptoms disappeared when the young women were removed from the pressures of courtship season. A rest cure in the countryside, away from calling cards and chaperones, and the constant scrutiny of potential suitors, often produced miraculous recoveries, but returned them to the marriage market, and the symptoms invariably returned. The men weren't immune to the psychological pressures either. The elaborate performance required of Victorian gentlemen created its own forms of breakdown. Young men were expected to be simultaneously passionate and controlled, aggressive and respectful, confident and humble. They were supposed to pursue women ardently while respecting elaborate boundaries, express desire while maintaining perfect propriety, demonstrate their worth while never appearing to try too hard. The result was a generation of men who often had no idea how to express genuine emotion or form authentic relationships. Many became trapped in the performance of courtship, so focused on following the proper protocols that they lost touch with their actual feelings. Some developed what contemporary observers called bachelor neurosis, a condition that manifested as an inability to commit to any relationship despite years of supposedly successful courtship activities. The psychological toll was perhaps most visible in the elaborate fantasy lives that developed around the restrictions of the courtship system. Unable to express genuine feelings directly, many young people retreated into rich interior worlds, where they could imagine the relationships that were impossible in reality. The popularity of romantic novels during this period wasn't just entertainment, it was a form of psychological escape from the emotional constraints of real life. Miss Emily Thornfield, whose detailed diary from the 1870s provides unusual insight into the inner life of a Victorian young woman, wrote extensively about her elaborate fantasies involving the young men who called on her. In reality, she could barely exchange more than pleasantries with them under the watchful eye of her chaperone. In her imagination, she conducted passionate love affairs, dramatic reconciliations, and elaborate romantic adventures that bore no resemblance to the stilted interactions of her actual social life. The gap between fantasy and reality created its own psychological problems. Young people developed unrealistic expectations about love and marriage, based on their idealized imaginings, rather than any actual experience with romantic relationships. They entered marriage as strangers to each other and to themselves, carrying elaborate romantic fantasies that had no basis in reality and no possibility of fulfillment within the constraints of Victorian married life. The repression of normal courtship behavior also led to the development of what might be called displaced romantic expression. Unable to conduct relationships directly, young people found other outlets for their emotional and physical needs. The Victorian era saw an explosion of interest in sentimental friendship, artistic expression, religious enthusiasm, and various forms of what would now be recognized as sublimated sexuality. Women developed intensely emotional relationships with each other that often resembled romantic attachments more than friendships. Men threw themselves into athletic activities, military pursuits, or intellectual obsessions that provided outlets for the energy and passion they couldn't express in courtship. These displacement activities were often encouraged by parents and society as healthy alternatives to premature romantic involvement. without recognition of what they actually represented. The most disturbing aspect of the psychological effects was the way the courtship system trained people to see relationships primarily in terms of performance and social positioning, rather than emotional connection. Young people learned to evaluate potential partners based on their ability to navigate social protocols rather than their character, compatibility, or genuine affection. They developed skills in impression management and social manipulation that often undermined their capacity for authentic emotional intimacy. The performance aspect became so ingrained that many people lost the ability to distinguish between their authentic selves and their courtship personas. They had spent so many years presenting carefully crafted versions of themselves that they no longer knew who they really were, underneath all the social performance. This identity confusion often persisted well into marriage, creating relationships between people who had never actually met each other's genuine personalities. The competitive nature of the courtship system also created lasting psychological damage. Young people learned to see potential romantic partners as prizes to be won, rather than human beings to be understood and appreciated. They developed strategies for defeating rivals, presenting themselves in the most advantageous light, and manipulating social situations to their benefit. These skills, while useful for social success, were destructive to the kind of vulnerability and honesty required for genuine intimate relationships. The emphasis on external validation created a generation of people who measured their worth primarily through social approval rather than personal satisfaction or authentic connection. Success in courtship was defined by securing an appropriate marriage partner, rather than finding someone who genuinely understood and appreciated them. This external focus often left people feeling empty and disconnected, even when they achieved all their social objectives. The system also created profound anxiety about authenticity. People who had spent years hiding their true thoughts, feelings, and personalities behind socially appropriate facades often became terrified of revealing themselves even to their closest intimates. They had learned that acceptance was conditional on proper performance, and they carried this lesson into their marriages, creating relationships based on continued pretense rather than genuine intimacy. The elaborate deception required by the courtship system also had lasting psychological effects. Young people learned to hide their true feelings, present false personas, and communicate through coded messages that often obscured rather than revealed their actual thoughts and emotions. This training in emotional dishonesty often carried over into marriage, creating relationships based on performance rather than genuine connection. By the 1880s, some observers were beginning to recognize the psychological damage caused by the elaborate courtship system. Progressive physicians and social reformers began to argue that the restrictions placed on normal human interaction were creating more problems than they solved, but their voices were largely drowned out by those who insisted that any relaxation of moral standards would lead to social chaos. The irony was that the system designed to ensure moral behavior was actually creating psychological conditions that made genuine morality more difficult. Young people who had been trained to hide their feelings, manipulate their appearance, and compete for social advantage were ill-equipped to form the kind of honest, committed relationships that Victorian society claimed to value. The psychological pressure also manifested in physical symptoms that contemporary medicine was ill-equipped to understand or treat. The rates of what was then called hysteria, neurasthenia, and various forms of nervous disorder were significantly higher among young people of courtship age, particularly those from families wealthy enough to participate fully in the elaborate social rituals. The treatment for these psychological problems often made them worse. Young women suffering from nervous exhaustion were typically prescribed rest cures that involved even greater isolation from normal social interaction. Young men with bachelor neurosis were often encouraged to travel or pursue vigorous physical activity. neither of which addressed the underlying emotional problems created by their inability to form genuine relationships. The most tragic casualties of the system were those who simply gave up on the possibility of authentic relationships altogether. Some young people, overwhelmed by the complexity and artificiality of Victorian courtship, withdrew from social interaction entirely. Others went through the motions of courtship and marriage without ever developing the capacity for genuine emotional intimacy, creating families that were models of social propriety but deserts of emotional connection. The children raised in these emotionally sterile households often perpetuated the cycle, learning from their parents that relationships were primarily social and economic arrangements rather than emotional bonds. The psychological damage of the Victorian courtship system thus extended beyond a single generation, creating patterns of emotional dysfunction that would persist well into the 20th century. Perhaps most disturbing was the way the system normalized psychological manipulation and emotional dishonesty as essential skills for social success. Young people learned to see deception, performance, and strategic emotional withholding as virtues rather than character flaws. The elaborate courtship protocols taught them that authentic self-expression was dangerous, and that their value as human beings depended on their ability to meet external standards of behavior rather than develop genuine personal qualities. The Victorian courtship system, designed to protect young people from the dangers of unregulated emotion, instead created psychological conditions that made healthy emotional development nearly impossible. It was a perfect example of the way elaborate social engineering can produce effects that are exactly opposite to its stated intentions, creating the very problems it was designed to prevent while making the solutions it was supposed to provide increasingly elusive. By the final decades of the 19th century, the Victorian courtship system had achieved something unprecedented in human history. It had successfully bureaucratized love. What had once been a natural process of attraction, compatibility assessment, and emotional bonding had been transformed into something resembling a government office procedure, complete with forms to fill out, protocols to follow, and enough red tape to strangle Cupid himself. The transformation was so complete that many young people had never experienced spontaneous romantic interaction. They literally didn't know what it felt like to have an unscripted conversation with someone of the opposite sex, to express genuine emotion without calculating its social implications, or to make romantic decisions based on their actual feelings rather than family strategy and social positioning. The death of spontaneity wasn't sudden. It was a slow strangulation that took place over decades, as each generation added new layers of protocol to an already complex system. What began as reasonable precautions against hasty romantic decisions had evolved into a regulatory framework so elaborate that it prevented not just bad decisions, but any decisions at all. Consider the typical courtship timeline by the 1880s. A successful romantic relationship from introduction to marriage typically required between 18 months and 3 years, during which the couple would progress through carefully defined stages, each with its own protocols, requirements, and waiting periods. The process was so standardized that etiquette manuals could provide precise timetables for romantic development, complete with checklists of appropriate milestones and warning signs of inappropriate acceleration. The introduction phase typically lasted several weeks, during which the couple was expected to assess basic compatibility through carefully supervised conversation about approved topics. This was followed by the acquaintance phase, which could last several months and involved regulated social interaction in various approved settings. Only then could the relationship progress to the courtship phase, with its elaborate rituals of calling, correspondence, and chaperoned activities. Each phase had specific requirements that had to be met before progression was allowed. Written permission from parents, character references from family friends, financial assessments, and social background checks were all standard requirements. The process resembled nothing so much as applying for a mortgage, except that the collateral was your entire future happiness, and the approval process involved the moral scrutiny of everyone you'd ever met. The bureaucratization reached absurd levels in the realm of correspondence. Letters between courting couples weren't just subject to parental review. They were often required to follow standardized formats that ensured appropriate content and tone. Some families employed professional letter writers to help their children craft correspondence that met all social requirements, while expressing the minimum amount of actual personality necessary to maintain interest. Miss Prudence Whitmore, a professional correspondence advisor of the 1880s, kept detailed files on her clients' romantic progress, tracking the development of each relationship through the careful analysis of letter content, frequency of correspondence, and adherence to approved communication protocols. Her services included editing drafts to ensure appropriate sentiment levels, timing recommendations for various types of correspondence, and strategic advice on how to express interest without appearing forward or disinterest without causing offense. The commodification of romance reached its peak with the emergence of professional courtship consultants, who offered comprehensive services for managing romantic relationships. These specialists provided everything from introduction services and compatibility assessments to ongoing relationship management and marriage negotiation. They maintained detailed databases of eligible young people, complete with family background information, financial assessments, and personality profiles that read like corporate personnel files. Some families employed full-time social secretaries, whose primary responsibility was managing their children's romantic prospects. These professionals handled scheduling for social events, coordinated calling schedules, managed correspondence, and provided ongoing strategic advice on relationship development. They kept detailed records of every social interaction, analyzing patterns and trends to optimize their clients' romantic outcomes. The most successful courtship consultants developed elaborate systems for matching compatible couples based on detailed questionnaires and assessment protocols. These early forms of scientific matchmaking attempted to eliminate the uncertainty and emotional chaos of natural romantic selection by reducing human compatibility to quantifiable factors that could be analyzed and optimized through proper management. The bureaucratization also extended to the physical aspects of courtship. Even something as simple as walking together required advanced planning, proper permissions, and appropriate supervision. Spontaneous meetings were not just discouraged, they were considered evidence of poor moral character and inadequate family supervision. Every romantic interaction had to be scheduled, approved, and conducted according to predetermined protocols. The psychological effects of this bureaucratization were profound. Young people learned to think of romance as a project to be managed rather than an emotion to be experienced. They developed skills in strategic planning, impression management, and outcome optimization that would have served them well in business careers, but left them completely unprepared for the emotional realities of actual relationships. The death of spontaneity also meant the death of genuine discovery. In natural romantic relationships, people learn about each other through unguarded moments, unexpected reactions, and spontaneous interactions that reveal character and compatibility. The Victorian system eliminated all such opportunities, ensuring that couples could spend years in courtship without ever seeing each other as they actually were, rather than as they appeared when performing their assigned social roles. The standardization of romantic relationships also eliminated the possibility of relationships that didn't fit predetermined patterns. The system was designed to produce marriages between people of similar social backgrounds, complementary economic situations, and compatible social aspirations. It had no mechanism for accommodating relationships based on genuine affection between people of different social levels, unconventional personality combinations, or emotional connections that didn't fit standard social categories. By the 1890s, the bureaucratization had become so complete that some young people were beginning to rebel against the entire system. The emergence of bicycle riding as a popular activity provided one of the first opportunities for young men and women to interact without constant supervision and rigid protocol. The freedom of movement provided by bicycles allowed for spontaneous meetings, unscripted conversations, and the kind of natural interaction that had been nearly eliminated from Victorian courtship. The bicycle became a symbol of romantic liberation, representing the possibility of relationships based on genuine compatibility rather than social engineering. Conservative observers were horrified by this development, recognizing correctly that it threatened the entire elaborate system of controlled courtship that had taken decades to construct. Other forms of rebellion began to emerge as well. Some young people deliberately violated courtship protocols, conducting relationships through unauthorized correspondence, unauthorized meetings, and other forms of romantic civil disobedience. These rebels were usually quickly suppressed by family pressure and social sanctions, but their existence indicated growing dissatisfaction with the bureaucratic approach to romance. The rise of lawn tennis provided another opportunity for more natural interaction between young men and women. Unlike most Victorian social activities, tennis required genuine spontaneous reaction and allowed for the kind of unguarded moments that revealed actual personality. The popularity of tennis among young people was viewed with suspicion by traditionalists who recognized its potential to undermine the careful control systems of formal courtship. The most damaging aspect of the bureaucratization was the way it trained people to see relationships as problems to be solved rather than experiences to be lived. Young people learned to approach romance with the same mindset they might apply to any other social or business challenge. Identify objectives, develop strategies, implement tactics, and measure results. This approach might have been effective for achieving social and economic goals, but it was devastating for developing the kind of emotional intimacy that makes marriages actually work. The bureaucratic approach also created a generation of people who were experts in relationship management, but amateurs in actual love. They could navigate complex social protocols with ease, but they had no experience with the vulnerability, spontaneity, and emotional risk-taking that characterized genuine romantic relationships. They entered marriage as strangers to each other and to their own emotions, equipped with elaborate social skills but lacking the emotional intelligence necessary for intimate relationships. The death of spontaneity in Victorian courtship represented a profound shift in human romantic behavior. For the first time in history, an entire social class had successfully eliminated the natural chaos and unpredictability of romantic attraction, replacing it with a managed system that promised better outcomes through better planning. The experiment was a complete failure from an emotional perspective, but it persisted because it served the social and economic interests of the families and institutions that had created it. The elimination of spontaneity had effects that extended far beyond romantic relationships. People who had been trained to approach love as a managed process often applied the same mindset to other areas of their lives, creating an entire generation that was uncomfortable with uncertainty, risk, and emotional improvisation. They preferred the safety of predetermined outcomes to the excitement of genuine discovery, even when that safety came at the cost of authentic experience. The bureaucratic approach to romance also created unrealistic expectations about the controllability of human emotion. People who had grown up within the managed system often believed that proper planning and protocol adherence could guarantee romantic success. When their marriages failed to provide the emotional satisfaction they expected, they often concluded that they hadn't followed the procedures correctly, rather than questioning the procedures themselves. The standardization of romantic relationships eliminated the possibility of learning from failure and adjustment. In natural romantic development, people learn from unsuccessful relationships and gradually develop better judgment about compatibility and personal needs. The Victorian system prevented this learning process by removing individual choice and experience from the equation, leaving people without the skills necessary to navigate relationships independently. The managed approach also created a false dichotomy between passion and propriety, suggesting that genuine feeling was inherently dangerous and needed to be controlled through external regulation. This perspective ignored the possibility that authentic emotion, properly understood and expressed, could be both passionate and moral, both spontaneous and responsible. By the end of the Victorian era, the bureaucratization of romance had become so complete that many people had lost the ability to imagine relationships that weren't carefully managed and socially approved. The spontaneous, passionate, chaotic nature of natural romantic attraction had been so thoroughly suppressed that it seemed foreign and dangerous to people who had been raised within the managed system. The legacy of this bureaucratization would persist well into the 20th century, influencing attitudes toward romance and marriage long after the specific protocols of Victorian courtship had been abandoned. The idea that relationships should be managed rather than experienced, that love could be optimized through proper planning, and that emotional spontaneity was dangerous rather than essential would continue to shape romantic behavior for generations. The collapse of the Victorian courtship system wasn't dramatic. There were no revolutionary manifestos, no burning of etiquette manuals in the streets, no mass declarations of romantic independence. Instead, it simply died of exhaustion sometime in the 1890s, like an overly elaborate pocket watch that had been wound too tightly for too long and finally stopped working from sheer mechanical fatigue. The end came not through rebellion, but through irrelevance. A new generation, influenced by American informality, technological innovation, and a growing weariness with artificial complexity, simply began to ignore the elaborate protocols that had governed their parents' romantic lives. They didn't reject the system so much as they walked around it, finding ways to form relationships that bypassed the bureaucratic machinery entirely. The bicycle played a crucial role in this quiet revolution. By the 1890s, cycling had become enormously popular among both men and women, providing opportunities for interaction that couldn't be easily regulated by traditional chaperone systems. Young people could meet accidentally on cycling paths, engage in spontaneous conversations during group rides, and develop relationships based on shared activities rather than formal social protocols. The freedom of movement provided by bicycles was both literal and metaphorical. For the first time in decades, young women could travel independently, make their own social arrangements, and engage in physical activities that made the elaborate restrictions of traditional courtship dress impractical. The simple act of riding a bicycle required clothing that allowed for actual movement, conversation that was natural rather than scripted, and interactions that were spontaneous rather than carefully planned. Conservative observers recognized the threat immediately. Mrs. Beatrice Hartwell, the etiquette expert who had spent decades refining the protocols of proper courtship, wrote with alarm about the dangerous informality that was spreading among young people. She warned that the abandonment of proper supervision and formal courtship procedures would lead to hasty marriages, inappropriate matches, and the general breakdown of social order. Her warnings were largely ignored. The younger generation had grown up watching their older siblings and cousins navigate the elaborate courtship system, and they had seen the results: marriages between virtual strangers, relationships based on social positioning rather than emotional connection, and a general atmosphere of artificiality that seemed to drain all joy and spontaneity from romantic relationships. The new informality wasn't just about bicycles and lawn tennis. It reflected a broader cultural shift toward valuing authenticity over protocol, genuine emotion over social performance, and individual choice over family strategy. Young people began to insist on the radical notion that they should actually like the people they married, that romantic relationships should be based on personal compatibility rather than social appropriateness. The rise of the telephone also contributed to the breakdown of traditional courtship systems. Telephone conversations couldn't easily be monitored by chaperones, and they allowed for a more natural form of communication than the stilted formality of supervised drawing room visits. Young people could have actual conversations, express genuine opinions, and develop relationships based on intellectual and emotional connection rather than carefully managed social performance. The economic changes of the late 19th century also undermined the foundations of the traditional courtship system. As more women began to work outside the home, and more men pursued careers rather than simply inheriting family businesses, the assumptions about economic dependence and social positioning that underlay Victorian marriage arrangements began to seem outdated. The death of the system was perhaps most clearly visible in the fate of its professional practitioners, the courtship consultants, social secretaries and relationship managers who had built careers around the elaborate protocols of Victorian romance found their services increasingly unwanted. Families began to view their elaborate systems and careful planning as impediments rather than aids to their children's romantic happiness. Miss Prudence Whitmore, the correspondence advisor who had helped orchestrate hundreds of successful Victorian courtships, wrote sadly in her final diary entries about the lamentable decline in proper standards among young people. She had devoted her life to perfecting a system that was now being abandoned by the very people it was designed to serve. The etiquette manuals that had once been essential guides to romantic navigation began gathering dust on library shelves. The elaborate rules about calling cards, flower language, and fan etiquette came to seem quaint and old-fashioned rather than essential social knowledge. A new generation of advice literature emerged, focused on individual happiness and personal compatibility rather than social appropriateness and family advantage. The decline wasn't uniform across all social classes. The aristocracy, with more to lose from social change, held on to traditional courtship practices longer than the emerging middle class. But even among the upper classes, the old systems began to seem increasingly artificial and counterproductive. The elaborate protocols that had once marked social refinement came to be seen as barriers to genuine human connection. The most telling indicator of the system's collapse was the way successful relationships began to bypass it entirely. The most celebrated marriages of the 1890s were increasingly those that had developed outside traditional courtship channels. Couples who had met through professional activities, shared interests, or simple social interaction rather than formal introduction and supervised courtship. These successful relationships demonstrated what the elaborate Victorian system had failed to achieve: marriages based on genuine compatibility, shared values, and actual affection. The couples who formed relationships outside the traditional protocols often seemed happier, more compatible, and more genuinely connected than those who had followed all the proper procedures. The psychological damage done by decades of artificial courtship became increasingly apparent as the system broke down. Many people who had been trained in the elaborate protocols of Victorian romance found themselves unable to form natural relationships when those protocols were abandoned. They had become so accustomed to managed interaction that spontaneous emotional connection seemed foreign and threatening. The generation that came of age in the 1890s found themselves caught between two worlds: the elaborate artificial system of their parents' generation and the emerging informality that their younger siblings took for granted. Many struggled to adapt to the new expectations of authenticity and emotional honesty after years of training in social performance and strategic relationship management. The professional infrastructure that had supported the Victorian courtship system gradually crumbled. The calling card designers found their market disappearing as simpler forms of social introduction became acceptable. The etiquette instructors who had specialized in courtship protocol found their expertise suddenly obsolete. The elaborate network of chaperones, social secretaries, and relationship managers discovered that their services were no longer in demand. By 1900, the elaborate machinery of Victorian courtship had largely collapsed, leaving behind only scattered remnants of what had once been a comprehensive system for managing romantic relationships. The flower language survived in simplified form, more as romantic gesture than coded communication. Calling cards persisted but became much simpler and less fraught with social significance. Chaperones gradually disappeared, their protective function replaced by new assumptions about individual responsibility and personal choice. The collapse wasn't entirely negative. The new informality allowed for more genuine relationships, greater individual choice, and relationships based on personal compatibility rather than social engineering. But it also eliminated some of the structure and support that the old system had provided, leaving young people to navigate romantic relationships without clear guidelines or social safety nets. The most profound change was psychological. A generation that had been trained to see relationships as social projects to be managed, rather than emotions to be experienced, had to learn new ways of thinking about love and marriage. The artificial complexity that had characterized Victorian courtship was replaced by a new emphasis on authenticity, individual choice, and emotional honesty that would come to characterize modern romantic relationships. The death of the Victorian courtship system marked the end of an era when romantic relationships were primarily social and economic arrangements managed by families and communities. It was replaced by the modern ideal of romantic marriage, based on individual choice, personal compatibility, and emotional connection. Whether this change represented progress or loss depended largely on one's perspective, but it was undeniably a fundamental transformation in the way human beings approached the most intimate aspects of their lives. As we settle back into our modern era of dating apps and casual relationships, it's worth reflecting on the bizarre spectacle we've just witnessed. An entire civilization that managed to turn the simple human act of falling in love into something resembling a cross between diplomatic negotiation and performance art. The Victorians, in their magnificent obsession with order and propriety, created a system so elaborate that it nearly eliminated the very thing it was designed to regulate. The legacy of Victorian courtship lingers in ways both obvious and subtle. Every time someone worries about making the right impression on a date, every time parents fret about their children's romantic choices, every time society creates elaborate rules about appropriate behaviour between men and women, we're seeing echoes of that grand Victorian experiment in romantic social engineering. But perhaps the most lasting lesson of Victorian courtship is what it reveals about the relationship between social control and human happiness. The Victorians genuinely believed that romantic relationships could be improved through better management, that love could be made more successful by making it more complicated, that passion could be refined through protocol. They were, in their way, trying to solve the eternal human problem of romantic disappointment and incompatibility through the application of rules, procedures, and careful supervision. They failed spectacularly, of course, but their failure was instructive. It demonstrated the remarkable resilience of human emotion in the face of social repression, the way genuine feeling finds expression even when buried under layers of artificial constraint. It showed how quickly elaborate social systems can become ends in themselves, serving the interests of the institutions that create them, rather than the people they're supposed to help. The Victorian courtship system also revealed something darker about human nature: our tendency to mistake complexity for sophistication, our willingness to sacrifice authenticity for social approval, and our capacity to convince ourselves that artificial solutions to natural problems are somehow morally superior to the messy realities they replace. The young people who struggled through the elaborate rituals of Victorian courtship weren't fundamentally different from young people today. They wanted to find connection, compatibility, and love. They wanted to be seen and understood and valued for who they really were. But they lived in a system that made these simple human desires almost impossible to achieve. A system that replaced genuine interaction with elaborate performance and authentic emotion with strategic calculation. The collapse of Victorian courtship wasn't really about bicycles and lawn tennis and changing fashion, though these played their part. It was about the inevitable triumph of human nature over social engineering. The way genuine feeling eventually breaks through even the most elaborate systems of control and regulation. The most poignant aspect of the Victorian courtship story Maybe how many people lived their entire romantic lives within its constraints, never knowing what authentic emotional connection might feel like. They conducted their relationships according to rules written by others, expressed their feelings through codes created by society, and made the most important decisions of their lives based on criteria that had little to do with their actual happiness or compatibility. These people weren't failures or victims in any simple sense. Many of them achieved exactly what their society told them to want: appropriate marriages, social respectability, and economic security. They followed all the rules correctly, met all the expectations placed upon them, and fulfilled their assigned roles with admirable dedication. But they did so at the cost of never discovering who they really were, or what they actually needed from intimate relationships. The tragedy wasn't that they were unhappy in any dramatic sense, but that they never had the opportunity to discover what genuine happiness might feel like. They lived in emotional black and white, when they might have experienced the full spectrum of human feeling. They settled for social approval when they might have found deep personal satisfaction. They achieved safety and respectability when they might have found passion and authentic connection. Some of them, in their private moments, seemed to sense what they had missed. The diaries and letters that survived from this era sometimes contain wistful references to roads not taken, possibilities unexplored, and feelings that had to be suppressed for the sake of propriety. But for the most part, they accepted their constrained emotional lives as natural and proper, having never experienced anything different. The most successful practitioners of Victorian courtship were often those who learned to find meaning and satisfaction within the artificial constraints of the system. They developed genuine affection for partners who had been chosen according to social criteria rather than personal preference. They created intimacy through shared adherence to common values rather than through emotional vulnerability. They found ways to express love through the approved channels of duty, respect, and mutual support rather than through passion or romantic connection. Yet somehow, against all odds, love did find a way, in the margins of the elaborate system, in the brief moments between protocols, in the subtle glances that chaperones couldn't monitor, and the coded messages that carried more meaning than their creators intended. Human beings continued to connect with each other in ways that transcended the artificial boundaries placed around them. The most remarkable aspect of the Victorian courtship system may be how often it succeeded despite itself. Couples who had been brought together by family arrangement and social calculation sometimes discovered genuine compatibility and deep affection. Relationships that began as strategic alliances occasionally blossomed into passionate partnerships. People who had never been allowed to have an authentic conversation during their courtship sometimes found their voices after marriage and created genuine intimacy within the constraints of their social roles. These successes weren't the result of the system working as intended, but of human nature asserting itself despite systematic attempts at suppression. Love, it turned out, was more persistent and resourceful than the social engineers had anticipated. It found expression through the tiniest gestures, grew in the smallest spaces of freedom, and flourished in circumstances that seemed designed to prevent its existence. The couples who achieved genuine connection within the Victorian system often did so by developing their own private languages and rituals that existed alongside and beneath the official protocols. They learned to communicate through shared references, private jokes, and subtle signals that carried personal meaning, while appearing to conform to social expectations. They created intimacy in the spaces between the rules, finding ways to be authentic while maintaining the appearance of propriety. These private rebellions against the system were rarely dramatic or obvious. They took the form of lingering glances that lasted just slightly longer than propriety required, of conversations that managed to convey personal feeling while discussing approved topics, of small gifts and gestures that carried emotional weight beyond their apparent significance. The most successful Victorian couples became experts at living double lives, one for society and one for themselves. The letters that survived from successful Victorian marriages often reveal couples who somehow managed to find genuine affection despite the system that brought them together. They learned to love each other not because of the elaborate courtship rituals they had followed, but in spite of them. They discovered compatibility through years of marriage rather than months of supervised interaction, and they built intimacy through shared experience rather than romantic performance. Perhaps that's the real lesson of Victorian courtship, that human beings are remarkably adaptable, that love is more resilient than the systems designed to control it, and that the heart will find its own way, regardless of the obstacles placed in its path. The Victorians may have created the most elaborate romantic bureaucracy in human history, but they couldn't eliminate the fundamental human capacity for connection, affection, and genuine emotional intimacy. As you drift off to sleep tonight, maybe take a moment to appreciate the simple freedom to express your feelings directly, to choose your own romantic partners, to have conversations without supervision, and to base your relationships on compatibility rather than calling card etiquette. The Victorian experiment in romantic social engineering may have been a magnificent failure, but it taught us something valuable about the importance of authenticity, the dangers of over-regulation, and the remarkable persistence of human love in even the most artificial circumstances. The elaborate drawing rooms are empty now. The chaperones have gone home. The calling cards have turned to dust, and the flower dictionaries gather dust on forgotten shelves. But somewhere in the quiet spaces between the rules and protocols, between the performances and pretenses, genuine human connection found a way to flourish, and perhaps that's the most romantic thing of all. The quiet triumph of real feeling over artificial form, of authentic love over elaborate pretense, of the human heart over the social systems designed to contain it. So as you settle into sleep, remember that behind all the Victorian propriety and protocol were real people with real feelings, struggling to find connection within constraints we can barely imagine, and somehow, against all odds, occasionally succeeding. Their elaborate courtship rituals may seem absurd to us now, but their fundamental desire for love, understanding, and genuine human connection remains as relevant today as it was in the gaslit drawing rooms of the 19th century. Sleep well, and dream of simpler times, when a smile didn't require a chaperone's approval, and I love you didn't need to be hidden behind the language of flowers.